The night hung heavy over the abandoned industrial district, where the rusted skeletons of old factories stood like silent witnesses to a bygone era. The streets were empty except for the occasional flicker of distant headlights that cut through the fog, then disappeared as quickly as they'd come. Shadows stretched unnaturally across cracked pavement, and the few remaining streetlights hummed an almost ominous buzz. It was a place most people avoided, a no man's land at the edge of the city, forgotten by progress and left to rot. For Alicia Kane, though, it was just another stretch of road, a shortcut on her way home. She had ridden through places far worse. Alicia leaned forward on the handlebars of her sleek black motorcycle, the powerful hum of its engine reverberating against the hollow shells of buildings. She was used to solitude, to the whisper of wind against her helmet, and the steady pulse of adrenaline that came with riding fast through desolate places like this. The smell of motor oil and damp concrete filled the air, familiar and strangely grounding. After 3 grueling months deployed overseas on a classified mission with her Navy SEAL team, this quiet emptiness felt almost peaceful. For someone like Alicia, who had spent countless nights moving under the cover of darkness through hostile territory, the eerie quiet of an industrial graveyard was a welcome change. She had always been different. A black woman leading an elite military unit in a male-dominated world didn't happen by chance. It came from relentless grit, discipline, and an unshakable will that had been forged through years of sacrifice. Alicia was no stranger to being underestimated, misjudged, or ignored by those who didn't understand her or didn't want to. But she'd never needed their validation. Her actions spoke for her, her leadership had earned her respect, and her reputation was untouchable. Even now, out of uniform and off the battlefield, she carried herself with the same quiet power that had made her a legend among her team. Underneath the black leather jacket and riding gloves, her muscles ached from months of pushing her body to its limits, but Alicia welcomed the pain. It was a reminder that she was alive, that she'd made it back when so many others didn't. Her bike sped through a wide-open stretch of road, the engine's roar slicing through the stillness, leaving a lingering echo in its wake. Alicia didn't expect company here. The industrial zone wasn't patrolled much at night. Local police usually stayed closer to residential areas, leaving these dark corners to themselves. But as she approached a broken intersection, she noticed it, a faint glint of light in her mirrors. A pair of headlights. Alicia's focus sharpened instantly. A car following her wasn't cause for immediate concern, but the way it lingered, mirroring her speed and movements, was enough to make her instincts twitch. Years of training had fine-tuned those instincts to a razor's edge, and she never ignored them. Carefully she eased off the throttle, her eyes flickering to the mirrors again. The car, a patrol vehicle, sped up just enough to close the gap. Alicia sighed inside her helmet. She'd been through this before, pulled over for no real reason, given suspicious glares for fitting the description. It didn't happen often anymore, but it still happened. Part of her considered ignoring it and speeding ahead, but the last thing she needed tonight was unnecessary trouble. She signaled a turn and smoothly pulled over to the side of the road, the glow of the squad car's lights now unmistakable as they painted the crumbling walls in a harsh, flashing red and blue. The sound of gravel crunching under tires broke the silence as the car rolled to a stop a few yards behind her. Alicia killed the engine and sat still for a moment, gathering herself. She was tired, bone tired. But something about this stop prickled at her nerves. Maybe it was the way the officer had followed her, deliberate and predatory, like he'd already decided something about her before even pulling her over. She slid her helmet off, shaking loose her tightly coiled hair, and clipped it to the side of her bike. The cool air hit her face, a welcome relief from the stuffiness inside the helmet. Alicia knew the drill: stay calm, keep her hands visible, don't give the officer any excuse to escalate. Even still, her jaw tensed as she heard the heavy thud of a car door closing behind her, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could feel his presence like a weight on her back. "Hands where I can see them," came the voice, sharp and cutting. Male, early 30s by the sound of it. The words dripped with authority, but the kind of authority that was trying too hard to establish itself. Alicia obeyed, resting her hands loosely on the handlebars. Her posture remained relaxed, even as her instincts screamed at her that something was wrong. The officer stepped into her peripheral vision. White, tall and broad-shouldered, with a rigid stance that reeked of aggression. His badge glinted under the dim light, and the nameplate read T. Miller. Officer Todd Miller. Alicia didn't flinch as he loomed over her, his hand resting casually, but deliberately, on the butt of his holstered gun. It was a gesture she knew well, one meant to intimidate. "Late night for a joyride," Miller said, his voice laced with suspicion. "You in a hurry to get somewhere?" Alicia turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with a calm, unwavering stare. Her expression was unreadable, a mask she had perfected over the years. "No hurry, officer," she replied evenly. Her voice was low and measured, carefully stripped of any emotion that could be misinterpreted as defiance. "Is there a problem?" Miller's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching on the edge of his belt. He looked her up and down, taking in the leather jacket, the scuffed jeans, the combat boots. She didn't look threatening, but something about her seemed to bother him. Maybe it was the way she wasn't afraid. He didn't like that. "License and registration," he snapped. Alicia suppressed a sigh. She reached slowly toward the pocket of her jacket, pausing halfway. "I'm going to grab my wallet," she said, her tone making it clear she wasn't asking. Miller grunted in approval, his eyes never leaving her hand. She moved with deliberate slowness, pulling out the worn leather wallet and holding it out to him. Miller snatched it from her hand without a word, flipping it open and squinting at the ID. His brow furrowed as he read her name, as though something about it didn't sit right with him. He glanced back at her, his lips curling slightly. "What's a woman like you doing riding a bike like this through a place like this?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "This your bike?" Alicia's grip tightened imperceptibly on the handlebars. Her patience was wearing thin, but she held on to it. She didn't owe him an explanation, but she knew better than to push back yet. "Yes, it's mine," she replied. "Is there a reason you stopped me, officer?" Miller ignored the question, his eyes flicking back to the bike, then to her again, as though searching for something to confirm whatever narrative he'd already written in his head. "Step off the bike," he ordered suddenly. The edge in his voice sharpened, and Alicia felt the shift in the air like a storm rolling in. Her gut told her this wasn't going to end as simply as a routine stop. She hesitated, just for a moment, then swung her leg over the bike and stood to her full height, her shoulders squared and her chin held high. Even without trying, she exuded an authority that unsettled Miller. He didn't know why, but he hated it. He hated the way she looked at him, not afraid, not deferential, just steady, unshakable. "I need to search the vehicle," Miller said, already moving toward the bike. Alicia's brow furrowed, her voice finally hardening. "You don't have cause for that." Miller froze, turning back to face her. His expression darkened, and his fingers flexed dangerously close to his weapon. "What did you say to me?" he growled, his voice low. For the first time, Alicia allowed her mask to slip, just a little. She met his glare head-on, her eyes like flint. "You heard me," she said, her voice carrying a warning. "You don't want to do this." But Miller didn't listen. He never did. The night air had turned sharp, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of old machinery and forgotten factories, a smell Alicia Kane barely noticed as she stood face to face with Officer Todd Miller. Her shoulders remained squared, her breathing steady and deliberate. Years of discipline and high-pressure combat had trained her to remain composed under far worse circumstances, but her instincts screamed that Miller's aggression was teetering towards something more dangerous. The way his fingers danced near his holstered weapon, the flicker of frustration in his narrowed eyes. Alicia had seen men like him before. Men who mistook authority for unchecked power. Men who lashed out when someone refused to cower. "Step away from the bike," Miller repeated, his tone colder now, edged with impatience. The words dropped like lead weights into the silence between them, but Alicia didn't move. She held her ground, her feet planted firmly on the cracked pavement, eyes locked onto his with unflinching resolve. "On what grounds, officer?" she asked evenly, her voice a calm counterpoint to his growing agitation. She wasn't being defiant. She wasn't raising her voice. But the quiet confidence in her words seemed to strike a nerve. Miller's face flushed red, his hand curling into a fist at his side. "Don't play games with me," he snapped. I said, "Step back. You don't get to ask questions. You do what I tell you to do." Alicia's jaw tightened. She had no patience for posturing, especially not when it came wrapped in this much unwarranted hostility. "I'm not playing games," she said, her tone clipped now, sharper than before. "If you're accusing me of something, then say it. Otherwise, this stop has gone far enough." Miller's expression darkened, and for a split second, he hesitated. He didn't have a real reason for pulling her over, at least not one he could say out loud. A black woman on a powerful motorcycle in an empty part of town late at night didn't sit right with him. But he couldn't put that into words, couldn't justify his actions beyond the bubbling assumptions that had driven him from the start. Instead, he leaned harder into the only thing he had, authority. "You don't get to decide when this stop is over," he growled, stepping closer. "I'll tell you when you can leave. Now, move back and let me do my job." He closed the distance between them, his boots scuffing against the gravel-strewn pavement. Alicia didn't move, but her muscles coiled like springs ready to act. Her patience, though vast, wasn't infinite. She could handle hostility. She could handle suspicion. But the moment this escalated into physical force, there would be no going back. And Alicia Kane wasn't the type to let anyone put hands on her unchallenged. "Don't do this," she said quietly, the warning clear in her voice. "You're about to cross a line." Miller's face twisted into a sneer, his lips curling in a mockery of a smile. "You think you're gonna tell me how to do my job? Ha! I've seen your type before. Think you're smarter than everyone else. Think the rules don't apply to you. I don't care how calm you act, you're not talking your way out of this one. Hands on the car, now." His voice echoed off the rusting walls around them, sharp enough to send a chill down the spine of anyone listening. But there was no one. Just the two of them locked in a dangerous standoff, the tension between them a taut wire ready to snap. Alicia's expression remained stony as Miller's hand shot out toward her arm, his fingers aiming to grip and force her into compliance. He didn't make it. The movement was instinctual, as natural to her as breathing. Alicia shifted her weight in an instant, pivoting her body just enough to evade his grasp. At the same time, her hand shot up, catching his wrist in a grip that stopped him cold. The suddenness of it caught Miller completely off guard. His eyes widened, shock flashing across his face as he realized how effortlessly she had countered him. "Take your hand off me," Alicia said, her voice low but carrying enough weight to freeze a lesser man in place. But Miller wasn't backing down. Embarrassment quickly turned to fury, and with a guttural growl, he yanked his arm free and stumbled back a step. His hand immediately dropped the baton hanging from his belt. The snap of it being pulled free cut through the air like a whip crack. But Alicia didn't flinch. She had already assessed him, already calculated every move he might make next. "You just made a big mistake," Miller spat, his teeth bared like an animal cornered and desperate to reclaim control. Alicia lifted her chin slightly, her voice cool and cutting. "No, Officer Miller, you're the one making mistakes." Miller didn't listen. Rage clouded his judgment, pushing him to act before he thought. He lunged forward, the baton arsing down in a violent swing aimed at her shoulder. For most people, that strike would have been the end of the fight. For Alicia Kane, it was nothing but a miscalculation on his part. In one fluid motion, she sidestepped the attack, her arm flashing up to intercept. Her hand closed around his wrist again, this time with far more force. Miller let out a strangled grunt as Alicia twisted, leveraging his momentum against him. His baton clattered uselessly to the ground, the sound ringing like a gunshot in the quiet. Before he could react, Alicia stepped in close, her other hand pressing against his chest as she swept his legs out from under him. The world tilted sideways for Miller, and he hit the ground hard, the air rushing from his lungs with a painful gasp. Alicia released him and took a measured step back, her breathing still perfectly controlled, her eyes locked on him like a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. She didn't want to hurt him. If anything, she pitied him. His arrogance, his recklessness, they would be his undoing. Miller scrambled to his feet, his face red and contorted with rage. "You're under arrest," he shouted, though his voice cracked with a hint of uncertainty. He reached for the radio on his shoulder, fumbling as he tried to call for backup. "This is Officer Miller, I need." Alicia cut him off with a single step forward, her voice slicing through his panic like a knife. "Don't bother," she said. "You won't need backup tonight. What you need is to take a long, hard look at yourself." Miller froze, his hand hovering near his radio as he stared at her, his anger momentarily eclipsed by confusion. Alicia held his gaze, unflinching. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "I warned you," she continued, her tone colder now, sharper. "You came at me with aggression instead of reason. You treated me like a threat because of what? My bike? The color of my skin? Or because I didn't roll over when you barked an order? Whatever it was, you've shown me exactly who you are tonight. And trust me, Officer Miller, I'm not impressed." Miller's chest heaved as he stood there, speechless. His radio crackled faintly, the voice on the other end calling his name, asking for an update. But he didn't answer. He couldn't. Alicia took one last look at him, at the man who had tried to exert power over her and failed miserably before turning her back to him. She walked to her motorcycle, her movements unhurried and deliberate. Miller didn't move. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching as she swung her leg over the bike and settled onto the seat. The engine roared to life beneath her, the sound reverberating through the empty streets like a war cry. For a brief moment, Alicia looked back over her shoulder, her eyes meeting his one final time. "I think about this the next time you pull someone over," she said. And then she was gone, the black motorcycle disappearing into the night, leaving Miller standing alone in the glow of his squad car's flashing lights. The air was different now, thicker, heavier, as if the industrial graveyard around them held its breath, watching the events unfold like a silent witness. The red and blue lights of the patrol car continued to spin, casting eerie, shifting shadows against crumbling factory walls, and Alicia Kane's black motorcycle. Todd Miller stood there, his chest heaving, fists clenched at his sides, as though trying to physically hold on to the authority that was slipping through his fingers like sand. He couldn't believe what had just happened. This woman, a biker, a nobody in his eyes, had not only countered his first move but had knocked him off balance in front of his own patrol car. For Miller, that was unforgivable. He straightened up, brushing dirt off his uniform with unnecessary force, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment, rage and bruised pride. The echoes of his fall still rattled in his ears, and he could feel the sting of gravel biting through his uniform where his elbow had hit the ground. His hand shot back toward his belt, where his baton had fallen moments earlier, but it wasn't there. It lay uselessly on the ground a few feet away, just out of reach. He glared at Alicia with undisguised hatred, her calm, steady gaze only fueling the fire raging inside him. "You're going to regret that," Miller growled, his voice low and strained, as though the words had been dragged through his clenched teeth. Alicia tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanging. Her dark eyes met his with an intensity that unnerved him further. She looked like a predator assessing its prey, not a woman caught in a police stop gone sideways. It was infuriating. "You started this, officer," Alicia replied, her tone as steady as ever, almost maddeningly so. There was no fear in her voice. No submission, just an unwavering calm that reminded him of a soldier or someone who had seen far worse than he could ever dish out. And that only made him angrier. Miller took a step closer, his boots grinding against the gravel with each deliberate movement. He no longer cared about procedure, about protocol. All he could see now was his own humiliation replaying in his mind. This woman, this stranger, had dared to undermine his authority, and he couldn't let that stand. "Turn around. Hands behind your back. Now," he barked, his voice rising to a shout that echoed across the empty streets. Alicia's brow furrowed slightly. "You're escalating this for no reason," she said coolly. "I suggest you calm down before you dig a hole you can't climb out of." "Shut up!" Miller roared, his composure now gone entirely. His hand shot toward his radio, pressing the button on his shoulder. "Unit 14, requesting immediate backup. I have a resisting suspect, female, black, mid-30s. Situation escalating. Send units now." A crackling response followed, barely audible under the tension. "Copy that, Unit 14. Backup en route." The words hung in the air like a promise of chaos to come. Alicia exhaled through her nose, her patience wearing thin. She had spent years operating in situations more dangerous than this one, had faced enemies with far deadlier intentions than a small-town cop with a power complex. But it was the principle of the matter that gnawed at her now. How often had she heard stories like this? Stories of authority wielded recklessly, people abused simply because they'd encountered someone who couldn't handle the smallest challenge to their ego. Miller stepped in close again, his hand now hovering near his holstered firearm. The movement didn't go unnoticed, and Alicia's body tensed. She knew the shift when a situation moved from bad to life-threatening, and this was it. "Step back, officer," she warned, her voice low, firm. There was no anger in it, just a clear, undeniable command. Miller froze for half a second, startled at the sheer authority in her tone. For that brief moment, she didn't sound like someone he could dismiss. She sounded like someone he should be afraid of. But he shoved the thought away, his rage blinding him to reason. "Don't tell me what to do," he spat, and before Alicia could react, he lunged again. This time he went for brute force, throwing his full weight at her, aiming to shove her back and take her to the ground. But Alicia was ready. Years of close-quarters combat training had honed her reflexes into something almost preternatural, and Miller's movements were clumsy by comparison. She sidestepped effortlessly, her body pivoting with precision, and Miller stumbled past her, his shoulder striking the side of the patrol car with a loud thunk. He snarled in frustration, spinning back around, but before he could make another move, Alicia acted. Her hand shot out, gripping the front of his uniform, and with a sharp yank, she threw him off balance again, sending him sprawling to the ground with a grunt of pain. His radio skidded across the pavement, crackling with static. Alicia stepped back, her eyes never leaving him, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. She didn't want to hurt him. She didn't even want this fight. But she also wasn't going to let him manhandle her like some frightened civilian who didn't know her own power. "Stop this now," she said, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to cut through the anger and noise. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Miller rolled onto his back, gasping for air, his face red and contorted with a mixture of fury and disbelief. For a split second, he looked up at her, and something shifted in his expression: confusion, maybe even fear. Who was this woman? Why couldn't he get the upper hand? But that flicker of doubt vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced once again by blind rage. Miller pushed himself to his feet, staggering slightly as he reached for his sidearm. Alicia's eyes narrowed, her muscles coiling as she prepared to act again. "Don't you dare," she warned, her voice a low growl now. But Miller didn't listen. His hand closed around the grip of his weapon, yanking it free from the holster in one clumsy motion. Alicia moved before he could aim, closing the distance between them in a blink. She struck his wrist with the edge of her palm, forcing his grip to loosen, and the gun clattered to the ground. In the same motion, she swept his legs out from under him again, sending him crashing to the pavement a second time. This time, Alicia pinned him there, her knee pressing firmly against his back, her hands holding his arms in a controlled but immovable grip. Miller struggled, grunting and thrashing beneath her, but it was no use. She was stronger, faster, and far more skilled than he could ever hope to be. "Enough," she barked, the sound sharp enough to snap him out of his frenzy. For a long moment, Miller went still beneath her, his breathing ragged and uneven. The weight of the moment seemed to finally hit him. He'd lost completely and utterly. Alicia slowly eased off him, stepping back and allowing him to sit up. He glared at her with a mixture of hatred and disbelief, his hands trembling slightly as he pushed himself upright. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. Alicia straightened to her full height, her gaze steady. "Someone who's not going to let you abuse your badge," she replied coldly. "You wanted to prove something tonight. Well, congratulations. You proved you're unfit for that uniform." Miller stared at her, his face pale now, his earlier bravado completely shattered. For the first time, the weight of his actions seemed to be settling on his shoulders. The crackling voice of dispatch echoed faintly from the forgotten radio a few feet away. "Unit 14, do you copy? Backup is en route. What's your status?" Alicia didn't wait for him to respond. She turned her back to him and walked back to her bike, her steps calm and deliberate. Miller didn't move. He just sat there, his breathing shallow, watching as she mounted the motorcycle and started the engine. The low, rumbling growl of the bike filled the empty street as Alicia turned her head, giving him one last look. "You might want to rethink your choices, Officer Miller," she said over the engine's hum. "Next time you won't be so lucky." And with that, she was gone, the sound of her departure leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The distant roar of Alicia Kane's motorcycle had faded, but the aftermath of her confrontation with Officer Todd Miller lingered like the acrid smell of burning rubber. Miller remained sitting on the cracked pavement, his breathing uneven, the weight of his failure pressing on him like a physical burden. The red and blue flashes from his squad car illuminated his face in a grotesque rhythm, accentuating his anger and humiliation. He couldn't process what had just happened. How had it come to this? How had some random woman overpowered him not once, but repeatedly leaving him sprawled on the ground like a rookie? His fingers dug into the gravel beneath him, scraping against the sharp stones as his mind replayed every detail. The speed of her movements, the precision of her counters, the strength in her hands, none of it made sense. Miller had been in plenty of scuffles before, enough to consider himself capable in close encounters, but Alicia had handled him like a child. It wasn't just skill, it was dominance. And that thought enraged him more than anything. Unit 14. Do you copy? Status report. The dispatch radio crackled again, its metallic voice snapping Miller out of his spiraling thoughts. He staggered to his feet, his uniform stained with dirt and shame. Reaching for his radio with trembling fingers, he pressed the button and tried to steady his voice. "This is Unit 14, he croaked. "Situation is under control. Backup not needed." There was a pause on the other end before the dispatcher's voice returned, cautious and skeptical. "Copy that, Unit 14. Confirmed no backup needed." "Confirmed," Miller barked, his tone sharper now, his pride rearing its head again. The last thing he wanted was for other officers to show up and witness his humiliation. He glanced down at his scuffed boots, and then toward the patrol car, where his baton and sidearms still lay discarded. Slowly he limped over and picked them up, his movements jerky, as though his muscles still carried the ghost of Alicia's grip. For a moment he stood there, gripping his weapon tightly, as if it might somehow restore the authority he had lost. But deep down, beneath the layers of anger and indignation, something gnawed at him, a quiet, insidious whisper that told him this wasn't over. Alicia Kane wasn't just some biker passing through. He had seen something in her eyes, something unnervingly familiar, a sharpness, a depth, a quiet confidence that belonged to people who'd faced battles far greater than he could imagine. The thought made his stomach turn. With a muttered curse, he climbed back into the squad car and slammed the door behind him. The interior was silent, save for the soft hum of the engine and the intermittent crackle of the radio. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, the leather cool against his palms. Miller sat there for a moment, staring blankly at the windshield, the fog outside swallowing up the flickering light of the street lamps. He needed answers. He needed to know who she was. Fumbling with the onboard computer, Miller pulled up the system and started typing furiously. His first instinct was to search for her name, Alicia Kane, something he'd heard her mutter under her breath when she'd warned him to back off. He entered it into the database, impatiently tapping his fingers against the screen as it processed. But when the results came up, Miller frowned. Nothing. No warrants, no flags, not even a speeding ticket. She was clean, too clean, like someone who'd been scrubbed out of the system. He narrowed his eyes and tried again, this time checking local registrations. He input the description of her motorcycle, a sleek black sport bike, with no visible decals, and cross-referenced it with city records. The result came up blank again. It didn't add up. Someone like her riding a bike like that shouldn't have been invisible. Miller's gut twisted as unease crept through him. Something about this was wrong. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden buzz of his personal phone on the passenger seat. Miller glanced at the screen and immediately tensed. It was his partner, Sergeant Blake, calling from his night shift across town. Miller considered ignoring it, but Blake was persistent. He always was. Reluctantly, Miller picked up. "What?" he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "Easy there, hotshot," Blake replied, his tone light but laced with curiosity. "Dispatch said you called for backup and then called it off. What happened? You finally find some excitement out there in the wasteland." Miller hesitated. His partner would tear him apart if he knew what had really happened. "It was nothing," he lied quickly. "Just a routine stop. Thought it was escalating, but I handled it." Blake chuckled. "You, handling things? That's a first." He paused, and Miller could hear the faint hum of a police scanner in the background. "Who was it? You get a name?" Miller's jaw tightened. "Some biker. Nothing important." There was a beat of silence. Then Blake's tone turned more serious. "Be careful out there, Todd. I know you like to push it, but one bad move and internal affairs will be breathing down your neck. You don't want to end up like Wilson." The mention of Wilson, a disgraced officer who'd been dismissed for misconduct, sent a chill through Miller. He clenched his teeth, his grip on the phone tightening. "I said it's fine," he growled. "Don't worry about it." "Whatever you say, man. Just watch yourself." Blake hung up, leaving Miller alone in the silent squad car once more. Miller tossed the phone onto the seat beside him, his mind racing. He hated Blake's condescending tone almost as much as he hated the fact that the man was right. One wrong step, one complaint filed, and everything Miller had built his career, his reputation could crumble. But tonight wasn't his fault. He'd been provoked. That woman had disrespected him, undermined him, and she needed to be held accountable. He stared out at the empty road ahead, the shadows stretching endlessly into darkness. Slowly, he shifted the car into gear, his hands steadying as the engine growled to life. He wasn't going to let this go. Not yet. He would find her again. He would figure out who she was and how she had managed to humiliate him so thoroughly. And then he'd make sure she regretted it. Meanwhile, miles away, Alicia Kane pulled into the garage of her modest, two-story home on the outskirts of the city. The engine of her motorcycle rumbled to a stop, and for a brief moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that came at the end of a long, exhausting day. Alicia swung her leg over the bike, tugging off her gloves and helmet before running a hand through her short, tightly coiled hair. Her face remained impassive, but deep in her chest, she could still feel the faint thrum of adrenaline that lingered after the confrontation with Officer Miller. She didn't regret how it had played out, far from it. Men like him needed to be reminded that their badge wasn't a license to abuse others, but something about the way he'd looked at her in those final moments gnawed at her. He hadn't just been angry, he'd been afraid. Alicia exhaled through her nose, pushing the thought away. She wasn't going to let one power-drunk cop get under her skin. She had faced far worse adversaries on the battlefield, and she had no intention of losing sleep over the likes of Todd Miller. Still, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. She'd seen his type before, men who couldn't handle being bested, who let their pride and ego drive them to dangerous places. Pulling open the door to her house, Alicia stepped inside, the familiar scent of leather and faint wood polish greeting her. It was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time all day, she allowed herself to relax. Tomorrow she would debrief her team. Tomorrow she would continue her work, her purpose. But tonight, she stood at the window for a long while, staring out at the dark horizon. Somewhere out there, Officer Miller was seething, plotting, convinced that he still held the upper hand. He didn't. He never would. The harsh morning sun slashed through Todd Miller's blinds like an unwanted intruder, cutting the darkness of his small, cluttered apartment. Empty beer bottles lined the coffee table. His uniform shirt was crumpled in a heap on the floor, the dried dirt from last night's events still crusted into the seams. Miller sat slouched on the edge of his sagging couch, his elbows on his knees and his face buried in his hands. His head pounded part hangover, part shame. Sleep had eluded him entirely, and every time he closed his eyes, the night replayed itself in flashes, the sharp sound of his baton clattering on concrete, the unrelenting grip of her hands as she put him down, her voice steady, cutting through the chaos like a blade. The humiliation was eating him alive. She hadn't just outmatched him physically, she'd taken his authority and crushed it beneath her heel. He couldn't let it go. He shoved himself upright, running his hands through his disheveled hair. The clock on the wall read 7:23 a.m. shift change was in less than an hour. The department would ask about last night's call. His report had been vague. A generic note about routine stop resolved without incident. Miller had told himself it was the best way to bury the whole mess. No one needed to know, but burying it didn't make the gnawing shame go away. Who the hell is she? He muttered to himself, pacing the room, his boots thudding against the peeling linoleum. She wasn't a nobody, that much was clear. The speed, the precision, the absolute control she'd shown. That wasn't something you learned in a self-defense at a community center. Whoever she was, she had training, military maybe, or law enforcement. The thought made him sick. If she was connected to something bigger, then what did that make him? He grabbed his phone from the table, scrolling through his contacts until he reached one name, Blake. His partner might be annoying as hell, but Blake had access to things Miller didn't. Databases. Quiet favors from dispatch. Miller hesitated for a moment before pressing call, grinding his teeth as he waited. The phone rang twice before Blake's gruff voice answered. Blake. "It's Miller," he said quickly. "I need a favor." There was a pause. Jesus, Todd, it's 7 in the morning. Did you sleep at all? Listen, Miller snapped, his tone clipped. I need you to run a name for me. Alicia Kane. She's someone I encountered last night. Last night? Blake's voice sharpened. What happened on your shift? It doesn't matter, Miller said, a little too fast. Just check. I need to know who she is, if she's military, law enforcement, whatever. I need details. There was silence on the other end. The pause dragging on uncomfortably long. Blake's tone was cautious when he finally replied. You're not screwing around with this, are you? If this is Iowa material, I'm not getting pulled into it. It's not internal affairs, Miller lied through gritted teeth. I just want answers. Fine, Blake muttered. I'll look into it, but you owe me. The call ended abruptly, and Miller dropped the phone onto the couch beside him. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself, but his hands were still shaking. He could already feel the walls closing in, the thin veneer of control he'd held for so long cracking like glass. Hours later, as Miller sat in his squad car in an empty lot, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. Blake! Miller snatched it up, his eyes scanning the text. Ran her name. No hits. Nothing on public records. It's like she doesn't exist. You sure about this? Miller felt the blood drain from his face. Nothing. No hits. It didn't make sense. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, the horn blaring angrily into the quiet. Alicia Kane wasn't just a name plucked from nowhere. She was something, someone, and he wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. She's hiding something, he muttered, his voice trembling with conviction. And I'll find out what it is. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Blake, this one brief but ominous. Leave it alone, Todd. Miller ignored it. 2 days later, Alicia Kane stood in the center of an empty training facility, the sound of her breathing steady and controlled. The concrete floors of the private gym were scarred from years of hard use, and the smell of sweat and oil hung faintly in the air. Sunlight poured in through high, dust-caked windows, cutting across the mats in sharp beams. Her muscles burned pleasantly from the morning workout, sweat trailing down her temple as she adjusted the wraps on her knuckles. The weight of her last operation had finally begun to wear off, but the incident with Officer Miller still lingered in the back of her mind. She'd seen men like him before, men who didn't know when to back down, whose insecurities pushed them into dangerous decisions. She hadn't wanted the situation to escalate, but the way Miller had looked at her that night, she knew he wouldn't let it go. She'd given him a warning. Whether he heeded it or not was up to him. Alicia rolled her shoulders, ready to move into another set of drills, when her phone buzzed from the edge of the mat. She grabbed it, frowning as she saw the message. "Heads up. Someone's asking questions about you. Department database pinged your name. Might want to watch your six." It was from one of her contacts, a former SEAL who now worked quietly in cyber intelligence. Alicia's jaw tightened as she read the message again. "Of course he didn't let it go," she muttered. She didn't have to guess who the someone was. Todd Miller. Her instincts had been right. She was about to type a reply when a faint noise outside caught her attention, the low rumble of an engine idling where it shouldn't be. Alicia's body went still, her senses sharpening. Carefully, she slipped her phone into her pocket and walked to the window, peering through the dusty glass. A police cruiser sat parked just across the street, the driver inside barely visible through the tinted windshield. Miller. Alicia exhaled slowly, her jaw tightening. The man really didn't know when to quit. She turned away from the window, tugging her wraps off one by one, her movements slow and deliberate. If Miller wanted to escalate this, he was about to get far more than he bargained for. Across the street, Todd Miller sat in his squad car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He could see her inside through the window, her figure silhouetted against the sunlight as she moved across the gym. She looked calm, unbothered, like she hadn't just spent the last 2 days living rent-free in his mind. He felt his pulse quicken, his anger bubbling to the surface again. He'd told himself he was just here to watch, to get answers, but the longer he sat there, the more the rage churned inside him. She had humiliated him, disrespected him. That wasn't something he could let go. With a sudden burst of energy, Miller pushed the car door open and stepped out onto the cracked asphalt. The slam of the door echoed across the street, a sharp sound that carried with it the tension of what was to come. Inside the gym, Alicia turned at the sound. She stood in the center of the mat, arms relaxed at her sides as she watched him approach through the open doors. Miller marched inside, his boots echoing against the concrete, his face set in a mask of determination and fury. "You didn't listen," Alicia said simply, her voice calm but carrying the weight of a warning. Miller stopped a few feet away, his chest heaving as he glared at her. "I don't take orders from you." Alicia tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "Then maybe you should start." For a moment, the two of them stood there, the air between them charged with an unspoken challenge. Alicia could see it in his eyes, the storm building, the moment of decision. He wasn't here to talk. "You want another lesson, Officer Miller?" she said quietly, taking a step forward. "Because you're not ready for this one." Miller's hand twitched near his belt, and Alicia's eyes narrowed. "Don't." But he did. The silence inside the training facility felt suffocating, thick and heavy like a storm cloud ready to burst. Alicia Kane stood perfectly still in the center of the gym, her posture calm but coiled with energy, her focus locked entirely on Todd Miller as he inched closer, his boots echoing sharply on the cracked concrete floor. Outside, the sun hung high, but the windows let in only slivers of light, transforming the gym into a cavernous, half-lit battlefield, a perfect metaphor for the conflict about to unfold. Miller's hand hovered near his belt, where his baton was clipped, and his face was twisted in a mask of desperation and fury. Sweat shone on his brow despite the chill of the morning, and his breathing had already turned ragged, as though the act of standing across from Alicia drained him of every ounce of composure. In his mind, this moment was his redemption, a chance to erase the humiliation of 2 nights ago, to reclaim control that had slipped through his fingers like smoke. "You should have stayed out of my way," Miller growled, his voice trembling as he took another step toward her. His fingers curled and uncurled near the baton, itching to draw it, to escalate this to a place where he believed he could dominate. Alicia didn't move. She didn't blink. Her expression was carved from stone, and her eyes held the kind of focus that sent chills down even the bravest of spines. She'd dealt with men like Miller before, people who mistook strength for dominance, who thought authority was a weapon to be swung recklessly. "Put your hands where I can see them," Miller suddenly barked, his voice cracking with the weight of his nerves. Alicia tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing into a faint, humorless smile. "Still playing this game?" she asked quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the empty space like a gunshot. "You've lost control, Officer Miller. You know it. I know it." "Shut up," Miller spat, yanking the baton from his belt in a single motion. The steel weapon caught the light, gleaming menacingly as he brandished it like a sword. "I said get on the ground." Alicia's body shifted, subtle and precise, her muscles tensing in preparation. This wasn't a battlefield, not officially, but everything in her instincts told her it was about to become one. She'd seen this look before, cornered men lashing out, fueled by desperation and ego. She'd faced it overseas, in combat zones where pride and misplaced anger turned soldiers into reckless fools. "Think carefully about your next move," Alicia warned, her voice lowering to a growl. Her feet were planted firmly, her shoulders relaxed, but there was no mistaking the readiness in her stance. Miller didn't think. He lunged. With a roar of anger, he swung the baton in a vicious arc, aiming for her side. The force of the strike would have dropped anyone untrained, but Alicia Kane was something else entirely. She moved like liquid, her body shifting to avoid the blow with a speed and precision that defied comprehension. The baton sliced through empty air, and Miller's balance faltered as he stumbled forward. Before he could recover, Alicia struck. Her movements were a blur, sharp, efficient, calculated. She grabbed his wrist mid-swing, twisting it with practiced precision that sent the baton clattering to the floor. Miller let out a strangled cry, his knees buckling as pain shot up his arm. Alicia didn't let go. She stepped forward, using his momentum against him, and drove him backward until his spine hit the brick wall behind him with a hollow thud. "Is this what you wanted?" Alicia hissed, her face inches from his, her grip unrelenting as she held his twisted wrist. Miller's eyes were wide now, panic overriding his rage. Sweat dripped down his temple, and his breath came in sharp gasps as he realized, too late, that he was hopelessly outmatched. "Let go of me," Miller sputtered, his voice breaking as he tried to push back against her, his free hand clawing uselessly at her arm. Alicia tightened her grip just enough to make him freeze. "You had your chance to stop," she said, her voice low, dangerous. "You were warned. Twice. But you couldn't let it go, could you? You couldn't handle being shown who you really are." Miller's chest heaved, his panic giving way to desperation. "You're gonna pay for this," he wheezed, his voice trembling. "I swear to God you'll—" Alicia cut him off with a swift movement. She released his wrist and stepped back, letting him stumble forward, nearly collapsing to the ground as he cradled his arm. He looked up at her with a mix of confusion and hatred, as if unsure why she hadn't finished him. But Alicia wasn't here to destroy him, just to show him the reality he refused to see. "You're not a victim here, Officer Miller," she said coldly. "You're a man who let his pride blind him. You thought this baton, this badge, made you untouchable. But look at you now." Miller glared at her, trembling with rage and humiliation, his back still pressed against the wall. He opened his mouth to speak, to shout, to threaten, to spit venom, but the words wouldn't come. They died in his throat as he looked at her, at the unwavering strength in her posture, at the way she stared him down like a wolf waiting for its prey to make the final mistake. Then, without another word, Alicia turned her back on him. Miller watched, dumbfounded, as she walked to the center of the gym, where the baton lay forgotten on the ground. She bent down, picked it up, and examined it for a moment before tossing it unceremoniously at his feet. The clatter of metal on concrete echoed through the cavernous space, the sound lingering like a judge's gavel striking the bench. "Go home," Alicia said quietly, her back still to him, "before you make this worse for yourself." Miller's hands trembled as he stared down at the baton, his breathing ragged. He wanted to lash out, to reclaim some semblance of control, but his body wouldn't cooperate. Every instinct screamed at him to stay down, to walk away while he still could. Finally, with a shaky exhale, Miller pushed himself upright, clutching his bruised wrist as he shuffled toward the door. He didn't say a word, he couldn't. The weight of his defeat hung over him like a shroud. When he reached the threshold, he paused, glancing back at her one last time. Alicia stood in the center of the gym, her shoulders relaxed, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him, and that stung more than any blow she'd landed. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the empty gym. Alicia remained where she was for a long moment, staring at the door with an expression that softened ever so slightly. This wasn't the victory people like Miller thought it was. She didn't relish moments like this, she didn't seek them out. But sometimes, the world needed reminders of its boundaries. Sometimes, the unchecked arrogance of a man like Todd Miller had to be confronted, no matter how ugly it got. She exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders as she shook off the tension. Then, without a word, Alicia walked to the far side of the gym, picked up her water bottle, and took a long drink. The adrenaline ebbed from her veins, leaving behind a calm focus. There was still work to be done, still battles to fight, some on the battlefield, others here, in places where power was abused and lines were crossed. But for now, the gym was silent. And for the first time in days, Alicia Kane allowed herself to let it be. The distant hum of traffic was the only sound filling the quiet, sterile office of the precinct captain. Todd Miller sat on the other side of the polished oak desk, his shoulders slumped, his uniform wrinkled and disheveled. The blinds were drawn, blocking out the morning sun, leaving the room dim except for the harsh fluorescent light overhead. Captain Reynolds, a grizzled veteran with grey at his temples and a voice like gravel, leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he flipped through the report Miller had submitted. The silence stretched, growing heavier with every passing second. Miller felt sweat gathering at the base of his neck, his stomach churning with a mix of shame and dread. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He told himself he was justified, that his actions were warranted. But the more he sat here, the more the events of the last few days clawed at the edges of his mind, refusing to be suppressed. Finally, Reynolds closed the file with a deliberate snap and folded his hands on the desk. He looked at Miller, his sharp blue eyes piercing through the younger officer like a scalpel. "What the hell were you thinking?" Reynolds said, his voice low but heavy with disappointment. Miller flinched, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for an explanation that wouldn't sound as pathetic as he felt. "Captain, she was resisting," he stammered. "She was acting suspicious." Reynolds raised a hand, silencing him. "Don't," he said sharply. "I've heard enough of your excuses. You're lucky this didn't escalate further than it did. You're lucky she hasn't filed a formal complaint or worse." Miller blinked, confused. "She hasn't?" Reynolds let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "No, she hasn't. But that doesn't mean you're off the hook." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk as he pinned Miller with a hard stare. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Do you know who she is?" Miller swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't. I tried to run her name, but nothing came up. I thought." "You thought wrong," Reynolds interrupted. He pulled a sheet of paper from the file and slid it across the desk toward Miller. "This came through unofficial channels this morning. I suggest you read it carefully." Miller hesitated, his hand trembling as he picked up the document. His eyes scanned the page, and with each line, his stomach sank further. "Alicia Kane, Commander, United States Navy SEALs, Classified Operations, Combat Decorated Veteran, Special Clearance Level." His grip on the paper tightened, his knuckles whitening as the weight of the information bore down on him. Alicia Kane wasn't just a random civilian or an ex-military officer. She was someone with power, real power, and a reputation that extended far beyond the precinct's jurisdiction. "She's one of the most respected operatives in the military," Reynolds continued, his tone hard. "And you? You thought it was a good idea to antagonize her, to escalate, to try and physically overpower her. Do you even understand how badly you screwed up?" Miller's mouth went dry. I didn't know," he said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, you didn't," Reynolds shot back. "Because you didn't stop to think. You let your pride, your ego, and whatever other garbage you're carrying around guide your actions. And now you've put this department in a very dangerous position." Miller sank lower in his chair, the paper still clutched in his hands. He wanted to defend himself, to argue that Alicia had provoked him, that she'd been disrespectful, that she'd what? He couldn't even finish the thought. None of it mattered. Not anymore. Reynolds sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. For a moment, the room was silent again, the tension hanging thick in the air. "Here's what's going to happen," Reynolds finally said, his tone calmer but no less firm. "You're going on administrative leave effective immediately. During that time, you're going to take mandatory de-escalation training, along with whatever other programs the department deems necessary. And if I so much as hear your name in the context of another complaint, you're done. Do I make myself clear?" Miller nodded numbly, his gaze fixed on the paper in his hands. "I said, do I make myself clear?" Reynolds barked. "Yes, Captain," Miller mumbled, his voice hollow. "Good. Now get out of my office." Miller stood on unsteady legs, his body moving on autopilot as he exited the room. The hallway felt impossibly long, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like an accusation. Every step felt heavier than the last, the reality of his situation sinking in with brutal clarity. Across the city, Alicia Kane stood at the edge of a private shooting range, the weight of her custom pistol familiar and steady in her hand. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, mingling with the crisp breeze that swept across the open field. A row of targets stood 50 yards away, each one bearing the faint scars of previous hits. She exhaled slowly, her focus narrowing as she lined up her shot. The pistol bucked in her hand, the sound of the shot splitting the air, and the bullet struck dead center on the target. Alicia lowered the weapon, her gaze steady, her breathing controlled. The confrontation with Miller hadn't shaken her. It took far more than that to rattle someone with her experience, but it had left her thinking, as incidents like that often did. How many times had she faced people like him? Men who mistook authority for power, who used their positions to belittle and intimidate instead of protect. She'd dealt with them her entire life, from the academy to the battlefield, and still they never seemed to learn. Her phone buzzed on the bench beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up and glanced at the screen. It was a message from a trusted contact, one of the few people who knew the full scope of her work. Miller's been suspended. They're making him take training. He won't be bothering anyone for a while. Alicia stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone back down. She didn't feel satisfaction. This wasn't a victory. Miller's punishment was a drop in the ocean compared to the systemic issues that had allowed men like him to thrive in the first place. But it was something. She holstered her pistol and grabbed her jacket, slinging it over her shoulder as she walked away from the range. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the field, and the air grew cooler with each passing minute. As she reached her car, Alicia paused, leaning against the driver's side door and gazing out at the horizon. She thought of her team, the men and women who'd fought alongside her in places far more hostile than this city. She thought of the battles still ahead, the ones that couldn't be fought with bullets or strategy alone. She climbed into the car, the engine rumbling to life beneath her. There was no room for complacency, no time to rest on small victories. The world was full of people like Todd Miller, and it would take more than one confrontation to change that. But Alicia Kane wasn't one to back down. Not now. Not ever. With that thought, she pulled out onto the road, the hum of the engine carrying her forward into the fading light. There was still work to be done, and she intended to do it.